Now we're going to go back to that 1995 referendum question. We're going to talk a little bit about it. So as I said in the sort of first video about that, one of the challenges is that that question refers to a bill sort of that isn't in the question and is not accessible. So it's making an assumption that you've read it and understood it when you may not have done so. So there's all kinds of details about that that's really, really important. So if I asked you to answer that question now, you probably don't know how to answer it because you don't have all of the information you need. That's part of it. I'm also going to go refer you back to how close this referendum is, right? You remember we said that the results are decided by 50,000 votes out of 4.5 million? Okay, that's a really close election. And then when they did the post-analysis, when they sort of went through everything, they discovered that the result was decided by 50,000 votes. So far, so good. But they found 86,000 invalid or spoiled ballots, which means that this referendum was closer than the number of people who couldn't mark their ballot properly or chose not to, I suppose. That means that this is really, really close, and this sort of raises some eyebrows in Ottawa about, hey, wait a minute, are we really going to allow the future of our country to be decided in this way without any kind of jurisdiction and sort of conversations about that? So the response from Ottawa is to pass Bill C-20, otherwise known as the Clarity Act, which gives Ottawa the power in any future referendum to rule on the clarity, that's the phrase they use, of both the question and the referendum result. What that practically means, in relevance to the 1995 referendum, is that you probably couldn't decide to separate from Canada if you had only won the referendum to do so by 50,000 votes. And on top of that, so that's sort of common if you sort of have followed up on the sort of cases where sometimes you need a supermajority and you need sort of you need to have more than 50% plus one to decide to do something because of the way that the sort of rules are written. This is basically Ottawa saying, yeah, we get to decide if that's what the case is. If this is a 50% plus one question, fine. But if this is a, no, you can't have one voter deciding whether Quebec stays or not within Canada, like that doesn't make sense. There's that kind of conversation. So there's that kind of piece, so you probably wouldn't be able to decide based on that. And the other thing that's sort of relevant here is that there was some discussion in 1995 and sort of in that era that the separatists had intentionally asked almost a trick question, that they had asked a question that was intended to confuse people so that they would vote yes instead of understanding what they were really proposing. So the other sort of piece would be that under the Clarity Act, under Bill C-20, it would be very, very unlikely that you would be able to ask a referendum question like that, in that you couldn't ask a referendum question that touched on, for example, referred to a bill that's not present, right? You'd have to sort of be clearer in the questions that you asked. And this is, as you might guess, viewed as, in Quebec anyway, by a lot of separatists, as sort of overstepping the boundaries and stepping into provincial affairs, and it's seen almost as a way of intentionally blocking separation, of making it more difficult for Quebec to separate intentionally. And that's a sort of perspective piece, right? If you remember the sort of modeling the FLQ and sort of the perspective that Quebec is being really oppressed by Anglophone Canada, the Clarity Act is seen by people who sort of think in that vein, not necessarily specifically that way, but like in that vein, is seen by people as sort of an attempt to keep Quebec in that subordinate position, which is kind of an important piece to look at. This is a law that is still on the books. It hasn't really been used all that often, but that's just because there haven't been a ton of referendums where it would need to be used. But again, the federal government is sort of saying that, like, no, guys, we need this ability. It's not appropriate to sort of have the future of the country for everyone decided by this, by sort of a small minority, a small number of people with a very confusing question. Like, that doesn't make sense. You can't do that. So there's that sort of tension around that law. Now that we've sort of gone through the referendums in Quebec, in some ways we're sort of going back to Métis history. And I sort of want to talk about this because it sort of leads us into the flashpoint of the Manitoba schools question. So that's what we're doing next. We're going to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Francophone population and the rest of the country.